It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. The new U.S. Defense Secretary, James Mattis, visited Baghdad on Monday in an attempt to ease relations with Iraq following President Trump's CIA headquarters address the day after his inauguration. Let's have a look.
When I was young, we were always winning things in this country. We'd win with trade. We'd win with wars. At a certain age, I remember hearing from one of my instructors, the United States has never lost a war. And then after that, it's like, we haven't won anything. We don't win anymore. The old expression, to the victor belong the spoils. You remember I always used to say, keep the oil. I wasn't a fan of Iraq. I didn't want to go into Iraq. But I will tell you, when we were in, we got out wrong. And I always said, in addition to that, keep the oil. Now, I said it for economic reasons. But if you think about it, Mike, if we kept the oil, you probably wouldn't have ISIS because that's where they made their money in the first place. So we should have kept the oil. But, okay. Maybe you'll have another chance. But the fact is, you should have kept the oil.
The U.S. Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, rolled back on that tone while he was in Baghdad, saying, "We are not in Iraq to seize anybody's oil."
We're not in Iraq to seize anybody's oil. I think all of us here in this room, all of us in America have generally paid for our gas and oil all along, and I'm sure that we will continue to do so in the future.
Joining us today to discuss the shift and the Defense Secretary's visit to Baghdad is Sabah Alnasseri. Sabah is a professor in political science at York University in Toronto. His latest publication is Arab Revolutions and Beyond: The Middle East and Reverberations in the Americas. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sabah.
Good to be with you, Sharmini.
Sabah, let's start off with your response to the comment newly inaugurated President Trump made at CIA headquarters in January and how that was received in Iraq.
Well, first, such a populist statement is addressed to the supporter of Mr. Trump to suggest that the Iraqis should cover the cost for the war and the occupation of Iraq, as if the Iraqi invited the United States to make the war and occupy Iraq. And the second thing, which is bizarre, because Mr. Trump knows very well that Iraqi oil is controlled by U.S. and other multinational corporations who steal Iraqi oil under legal and illegal terms, and sometimes with and sometimes against the will of the central government in Iraq. Now, how it was received in Iraq, there are two things, actually, not one. The first one is the question of the ban of the seven majority Muslim Arab countries. And one of them, of course, is Iraq. So the Iraqis, especially Iraqi MPs, were outraged. And some of them submitted a petition to introduce similar measure to ban U.S. citizens from entering Iraq. And General Mattis, when he was in Baghdad, he assured the Iraqi MPs and the Iraqi government that Iraqis who collaborate with the U.S. Army, that means who collaborate with the occupation, they would be allowed to enter Iraq, as if he somehow...
he is going to be standing at the border or entry points to the United States to facilitate that.
Yeah, as if he's doing them a favor. So he actually made the problem worse. And the second issue, of course, the question of oil. When President Trump claimed that the Iraqis should pay for the U.S. war and occupation, and the U.S. should have controlled the oil or steal the oil. The Iraqi population, much more than the Iraqi parliament, were outraged because they saw what happens to the Iraqi oil industry, how it was destroyed by the United States, and how all the contracts went to U.S. or other multinational corporations, and that the Iraqi population haven't seen anything from these funds, from the oil income, if you look at the healthcare, education, employment, etc. So General Mattis had actually a very difficult mission in Iraq. And before we start talking about what Mattis is doing in Iraq and how he was received, one shouldn't forget the code name of Mr. Mattis is Mad Dog. And this Mad Dog came from the massacre under his command that was committed by the U.S. Army and especially the Marines in 2004 in Fallujah and Haditha. So actually, General Mattis should be sued for war crimes. He and the Marine under his command, whom he also helped to get them out of the hook, not to be sued for war crime when they were under investigation and so on in Iraq. So the first thing, Mr. Matt should be sued actually for war crime. The most outrageous thing about the current governing class in Iraq, and especially the Shiite political party, Al-Dawa and Al-Hakim and so on, of the allies of Minister President Al-Abadi, that this Islamic party came to power with the support of the United States. And especially Mr. Trump and his team are the most Islamophobe cabinet in the history of the United States. So it's outrageous how these parties still, receive a general who committed war crime in Iraq and who's, part of a team, the most Islamophobe in the United States. And these so-called Islamist party, they call themselves Islamist party, and yet they received him and collaborate with him and consider what he was saying as trustworthy. I think that's the most outrageous part of the story.
Yeah, and let me add to that, Sabah, of course, the illegal war that was pursued and illegal declared by the United Nations. Let me add for those young listeners who have no history of this war at this time.
Yeah, I mean, the third thing that Mr. Trump is trying to suggest is that, seizing the Iraqi oil is part of a strategy to defeat ISIS. Because ISIS controls some of these oil fields, and if the United States would have, controlled the Iraqi oil, allegedly the Islamic State wouldn't have access to it. But it probably forgot, all these extremist groups, including the Islamic State, were the outcome of U.S. policies in Iraq, incarceration of 100,000 of young Iraqi, innocent Iraqi young people that under, incarceration, torture, and so on in Abu Ghraib, they were radicalized and became extreme. It is the outcome of the U.S. occupation. Without such an occupation and incarceration and torture, we wouldn't have Islamic State or any other extremist group for that matter.
Right. And Sabah, what do you ascribe in terms of the differences in rhetoric between Mad Dog Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, and the President? Now, given the background you've just described about Mattis, nevertheless, he comes across somewhat as the elderly statesperson trying to sort of mitigate the absurd words of Trump without trying to really say that. Of course, he can't say that, it's his president. But he does come across as the elderly, wiser statesman when he was in Iraq. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't think so. The problem is, President Trump gave his, security apparatus 1 month to come up with a plan how to defeat ISIS. And that means they still have 1 week to come up with a plan how to defeat ISIS. Mattis knows exactly, without the Iraqi on the ground, they cannot defeat ISIS. So that means he's under enormous pressure in Iraq to justify and to roll back on some of the statements of President Trump to assure the Iraqis that the United States will collaborate with them as usual, like before, to defeat ISIS. And he needs the collaboration of the U.S., of the Iraqi army and the popular mobilization unit and the anti-terror forces and the military police, etc. in Iraq. All these forces are waging the war on the ground against ISIS. He needs them to come up with a plan to, appease or pacify Trump's need for a plan against ISIS. And so that means without the collaboration of the Iraqi on the ground, neither Mattis nor Trump can do anything about ISIS or defeating ISIS.
Now, of course, as you just mentioned, Mattis is there in order to make a plan for defeating ISIS. And how do you think the plan will proceed, given what meetings took place in Iraq?
Well, it's not clear what actually President Trump mean with, defeating ISIS or eliminating ISIS from the face of the earth and so on. He didn't come up with any plan. And when he told the generals he wants a plan within 1 month, this is a wishful thinking. Consider the recent attack on ISIS in Mosul since October last year. And we talked about it already in October at the Real News. And we said that contra what the Iraqi government was saying, or the Pentagon, this attack on Mosul would take months. And we are still, in Mosul. Now the Iraqi army shifted from the east part of Mosul, mostly cleansed, not totally, but mostly cleansed from ISIL fighter, and they moved to the west side of Mosul. That means the historical center of Mosul. It's a small part of the city on the west part of the River Tigris, but it is a very narrow neighborhood, so it makes it enormously difficult for the Iraqi army to enter this part of the city and fight from house to house ISIL fighter. This would take a few months, if not maybe a year, to cleanse the east part of Mosul from Islamic fighter. So again, I mean, it's a wishful thinking of President Trump and General Mattis to come up with somehow a different plan to defeat ISIS, because President Obama, he increased the U.S. troops in Iraq for the first time since the withdrawal of the troops in 2011 to about 5,100 American soldiers and experts, etc., in Iraq, who are embedded in these actually war against ISIS in Mosul. So the only thing, and of course the U.S. give an air support for the Iraqi forces on the ground. So the only thing that Mr. Trump or Mr. Mattis would suggest is to increase U.S. troops on the ground. But I don't see how this will solve the problem and help defeat ISIS in the eastern part of Mosul.
Now, the Americans already have about 6,000 troops in Iraq. Now, this was soldiers committed by President Barack Obama. So adding to that, you're talking about adding to that. How are these 6,000 or so that are already there being received in Iraq?
Well, the problem is, as I said, I mean, the decision of this government, of the Interior Defense Ministry and so on, are mostly taken behind the scene. And not even sometimes the parliamentarians know what kind of a deal was made with the United States, how many experts or soldiers are there. And the second problem, of course, is still, despite all these years, we still don't have a national Iraqi army. We have different forces, different militias with different allegiances to different parties and so on. So you have different, American experts and advisors and trainers in different parts of Iraq. Some work with, let's say, with the Peshmerga in Kurdistan and have more collaboration with the Iraqi government or the Iraqi army. Some are embedded with some units of the Iraqi army, but other units don't know about their works. And some of the units of the Iraqi army were complaining that the United States and their air cover was not responding fast enough to give them the protection they need to attack ISIS. So there's miscommunication, there's problem with the support commands, which create confusion from the ground. So adding more troops will not solve the problem, which will increase the problem, because it will multiply the center of power and decision making.
And then finally, Sabah, to what extent do you believe that Trump administration's policy on Iran, as it has been developed thus far, which seems to be an effort to isolate Iran in many ways, how do you think that will affect the relationship with Iraq?
Of course, because Iran is the major player in Iraq after the withdrawal of the U.S. troops from Iraq in 2011. So the existence of American forces, experts, diplomats depends heavily on the collaboration of Iran in Iraq. And the Shiite party that govern Iraq, they are an ally of Iran. And so that means you cannot achieve any security, political, diplomatic issues or problems in Iraq without the collaboration of Iran. Making such statements, threatening Iran with war or sanctions, rolling back and trying to renegotiate the nuclear agreement is, as I said, it's a fair policy. Trump will realize very soon, I hope his advisor, if there are some rational advisor among his team, will inform him that, this is the least you want, to create a new conflict, new front against Iran, because this will complicate and jeopardize all the U.S. security policy, etc., in the region, especially in Iraq.
Very well. I thank you so much for joining us today, Sabah, and I look forward to having you back on the Real News Network.
Thanks for having me, Shabini.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.